For 8 months they were just polite neighbors. Until the night she appeared in his doorway and changed everything with a single wordless gesture. The old house on Maple Street had seen better days, but it had character. The kind of character that real estate agents call vintage charm, when they're trying to sell a place that creaks at night and has pipes that sing opera when you turn on the hot water. David had been living on the second floor for 8 months now. At 32, he was still getting used to living alone again. His small apartment upstairs was perfect for his work as a graphic designer. He had set up his computer by the big window that looked out over the neighborhood, where he could watch people walking their dogs and kids riding bikes after school. The rent was fair, much cheaper than the downtown apartments he had looked at before. But the real reason he stayed was the quiet. After 2 years of lawyers and paperwork and dividing up everything he had built with his ex-wife, David needed peace. He needed a place where nobody asked him how he was doing with that concerned look in their eyes. His landlady lived downstairs. Her name was Elena, and she was probably around his age, maybe a little older. She had dark hair that she usually wore pulled back, and paint under her fingernails most of the time. David had figured out pretty quickly that she was an artist. Sometimes he could hear her moving around downstairs, and occasionally he caught the smell of turpentine drifting up through the old floorboards. They had a good arrangement. She left his mail on the little table by the front door. He shoveled the snow from the walkway in winter without being asked. When something broke, like the washing machine that made sounds like an angry bear, they split the cost of fixing it. They were polite neighbors, nothing more. David liked it that way. Elena seemed to like it that way too. Sometimes they would pass each other coming or going, and they would nod and say good morning or ask about the weather. Safe topics. Easy topics. The kind of conversations you have with someone you respect but don't really know. He had learned a few things about her over the months just from living in the same house. She worked late a lot. She listened to classical music, the kind with lots of violins that made you think of old movies. She got her groceries delivered on Wednesdays. She had a small car that she only drove on weekends, walking most places during the week. David respected that Elena kept to herself. In his previous life, when he was married, there had always been neighbors who wanted to chat over the fence, friends who dropped by without calling, family members who had opinions about everything he did. Now he had space to breathe, space to figure out who he was when he wasn't half of a couple anymore. His business was going well. Working from home meant he could take on clients from anywhere, and word was getting around that he was reliable and creative. He had designed logos for 3 small businesses in town, and he was working on a website project for a restaurant that wanted to look more modern. The work kept his mind busy, which was exactly what he needed. The house itself was like living inside a time capsule. The stairs squeaked on the 3rd and 7th steps. The bathroom had one of those old clawfoot tubs that took forever to fill, but was perfect for soaking after a long day. The kitchen had been updated sometime in the past decade, but it still had the original cabinets with glass fronts where you could see all the dishes. David had made the place comfortable without making it too permanent. A good couch from the furniture store, some lamps that gave off warm light, books on the shelves, and his computer set up by the window. It felt like home without feeling like he was trying too hard to make it home. The neighborhood was the kind where people still knew each other's names. Mrs. Chen from next door brought him soup when he had the flu in March. The family across the street always waved when he was getting his mail. Kids played basketball in the driveway 2 houses down, and their ball occasionally bounced into his yard. He always threw it back with a smile. It was a Thursday evening in late September when David first noticed something different about Elena's routine. Usually her lights downstairs went out around 10 o'clock. But that night, as he was finishing up work on a logo design that had been giving him trouble all week, he noticed her lights were still on past midnight. Classical music was drifting up through the floor, but it was different music than usual. Sadder somehow, more emotional. David found himself listening to it while he worked, the melody weaving through his concentration as he adjusted colors and moved text around on his screen. He wondered if everything was okay downstairs. In 8 months of living here, Elena had been as consistent as clockwork. Same routine every day, same quiet, polite distance. But something felt different that night. The music was louder than usual, and he could hear her moving around more than normal. David finished his work around 1 in the morning and saved his files. As he got ready for bed, he could still hear the music playing downstairs. He almost knocked on her door to check if she was all right, but he stopped himself. They had an understanding about space and privacy. Whatever was going on, it wasn't his business. But as he lay in bed that night listening to the sad violins coming through the floor, David realized he had been more aware of Elena than he had admitted to himself, more curious about the person who lived quietly below him, who painted pictures and listened to beautiful music and kept her own counsel. He fell asleep wondering what had changed in the house on Maple Street, not knowing that his own quiet world was about to change too. 3 days passed after that strange Thursday night. David found himself paying more attention to the sounds from downstairs, though he tried not to admit it to himself. Elena's routine seemed to have shifted. Her lights stayed on later, and sometimes he heard her pacing around her living room at odd hours. Friday came and went quietly. Saturday brought rain that drummed against the windows all day. David worked on a new project for a coffee shop that wanted their logo to feel warm and inviting. He spent hours trying different fonts and colors, but his mind kept wandering to the music he had heard drifting up from downstairs. Sunday evening arrived with more rain. David was deep in work mode, the kind of focused concentration that made hours disappear. He had finally cracked the coffee shop logo and was fine-tuning the details. His desk lamp created a small pool of warm light in the otherwise dark room, and his computer screen glowed as he made tiny adjustments to shadows and curves. The house was quiet except for the rain and the soft hum of his computer. Elena's music wasn't playing tonight, which somehow felt more noticeable than when it was there. David had gotten used to the gentle background of classical melodies, and without them, the silence felt heavier. He was adjusting the spacing between letters when he heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up to his floor. David paused, his hand hovering over the mouse. In 8 months of living here, Elena had never come upstairs except when the washing machine flooded and she needed to check if any water had leaked through the ceiling. But there was no emergency tonight. No practical reason for her to be climbing those squeaky steps. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. David waited, expecting to hear her knock on the door of the small storage room at the end of the hall, or maybe checking the thermostat that controlled heat for both floors. Instead, he heard nothing but the rain against the windows and his own heartbeat, which had suddenly gotten louder. Then he saw her. Elena appeared in the doorway of his office, and David looked up from his computer screen. She was wearing a silk robe, the kind that caught the light from his desk lamp and seemed to shimmer slightly. Her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back like usual, and her face held an expression David had never seen before. She looked vulnerable but determined, like someone who had made a difficult decision and was seeing it through no matter how scared she felt. Her dark eyes met his, and in that moment, David realized that all their polite conversations and respectful distance had been covering something much deeper. Without saying a word, Elena let the robe slip from her shoulders and fall softly to the floor. David's breath caught, not just because of what he was seeing, but because of what it meant. This wasn't about attraction or loneliness or any of the simple explanations his mind tried to grab onto. This was Elena telling him something she couldn't put into words. This was her saying that 8 months of careful boundaries and polite small talk had been a way of protecting something that felt too important to risk. She smiled then, soft and gentle, and David understood. The smile wasn't bold or seductive. It was honest. It was Elena showing him who she really was beneath all the careful politeness, beneath the routine of being neighbors who kept their distance. It was her way of saying that she trusted him with something precious. David saved his work without looking away from her eyes, then slowly closed his laptop. The room got darker with just the desk lamp, creating a warm, golden space that felt separate from the rest of the world. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside, but inside time seemed to slow down. He stood up from his chair, his heart racing not from excitement but from recognition. Recognition that this moment had been building for months without either of them acknowledging it. Recognition that Elena was offering him something real and rare, the chance to truly see and be seen by another person. When David reached her, he didn't rush. Instead, he looked into her eyes and saw months of careful watching, of wondering, of building trust one small interaction at a time. He saw someone who had been as lonely as he was, as careful about letting people close, as afraid of being disappointed again. Elena's smile deepened, and she reached up to touch his face gently. Her fingers were warm, and they trembled just slightly, showing David that despite her courage in coming here, she was still scared. Still vulnerable, still taking a leap of faith that he wouldn't hurt the trust she was placing in him. The rain outside got heavier, creating a cocoon of sound around the old house. David realized that Elena hadn't just walked upstairs tonight. She had walked past months of fear, past all the reasons why this was complicated, past all the safe boundaries they had built. She had decided that what was growing between them was worth the risk of everything changing. As David wrapped his arms around her, he understood that his quiet life in the upstairs apartment was over. But looking into Elena's eyes, seeing the trust and hope there, he realized he was ready for whatever came next. The careful distance they had maintained was dissolving, replaced by something much more frightening and much more real. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the little circle of lamplight, two people who had been strangers living in the same house began to discover who they might become together. What happened next wasn't rushed or frantic like in the movies. Instead, it was gentle and slow, like two people who had been waiting a long time for permission to truly know each other. David and Elena moved to the old couch by the window, where they could hear the rain painting patterns against the glass. They talked in whispers at first, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell that had brought them to this moment. Elena told him about the 3 nights she had stayed awake, pacing her apartment and listening to sad music, trying to work up the courage to knock on his door. "I kept telling myself I was being silly," she said, her voice soft in the lamplight. "We barely know each other. We just say good morning and talk about the weather." David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But that's not really true, is it? I know you paint when you can't sleep. I know you hum along to your classical music when you think nobody can hear. I know you always check the mail twice because you're hoping for something good." Elena's eyes widened. "You notice all that?" "I notice everything about you," David admitted. "I have been for months. I just didn't think I had the right to notice." As the night wore on, they discovered how much they had learned about each other just by sharing the same space. Elena had noticed that David always worked late on Sundays, that he made the same breakfast every morning, that he talked to himself when he was solving problems with his designs. "Sometimes I would sit by my kitchen window just to hear you moving around up here," Elena confessed. It made the house feel less empty. They shared stories they had never told anyone. David talked about the day his marriage ended, how his wife had looked at him across their kitchen table and said she felt like she was living with a stranger, how he had realized she was right, that somewhere along the way he had forgotten who he was outside of being someone's husband. Elena told him about her last relationship, about a man who had slowly convinced her that her art wasn't important, that she should focus on practical things instead of painting, how she had almost stopped creating entirely before she realized she was disappearing into someone else's idea of who she should be. "After he left, I bought this house with the money from selling my paintings," Elena said. "I promised myself I would never let anyone make me feel small again." "You're not small," David said, meaning it completely. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Do you know how much courage it took to walk up those stairs tonight?" Elena smiled, the same gentle smile she had given him in the doorway, but now it felt like coming home. "I was terrified, but I was more terrified of pretending we were just neighbors for another 8 months." They talked about their dreams, the ones they had put away when life got complicated. Elena wanted to have her own art show someday, to see people standing in front of her paintings and feeling something real. David had always wanted to design book covers, to help stories find their way to readers through images that captured the heart of the tale. "Why don't you?" Elena asked when he told her about the book cover dream. David shrugged. "I don't know any publishers. It seems impossible." "I didn't know anyone in the art world either," Elena said, "but I started small. I sold paintings at the farmer's market, then to a few local shops. Now I have 3 pieces in a gallery downtown." David looked at her with new respect. "You never mentioned that." "You never asked," Elena said gently. "We were both so careful not to get too personal." As dawn began to lighten the windows, they realized they had talked through the entire night. David made coffee in his small kitchen while Elena stood wrapped in his old college sweatshirt, looking out at the neighborhood waking up. Mrs. Chen from next door was already in her garden, checking on her tomatoes after the storm. The family across the street was loading kids into their car for what looked like an early sports practice. The world was continuing exactly as it had yesterday, but everything felt different. "Do you regret it?" David asked, handing Elena a mug of coffee made exactly how she liked it with just a little cream. He had learned this by watching her make coffee in his kitchen that morning, filing away every small detail like it mattered. Because it did matter. Everything about her mattered now. Elena smiled, warmer than the coffee, brighter than the morning sun streaming through his windows. The only thing I regret is waiting so long. They spent that entire Sunday together, moving between comfortable silence and easy conversation. Elena showed him some of her paintings, stored in the closet of her apartment. David was amazed by the emotion in her work, the way she could capture loneliness and hope in the same brushstroke. David showed Elena his design portfolio, projects he was proud of and others he wanted to improve. She had an eye for color and composition that helped him see his work differently, pointing out strengths he hadn't noticed and suggesting changes that made everything better. We could help each other, Elena said as they shared a simple dinner David had cooked in his kitchen. I mean, with our work? You understand images and design. I understand art and galleries. David nodded, feeling excitement he hadn't experienced in years. I'd like that. I'd like helping you succeed. And I'd like helping you reach for those dreams you've been putting off. As Sunday evening arrived, they both knew they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. But looking at Elena curled up on his couch, reading one of his books while classical music played softly from her phone, David realized he didn't want to go back to the careful distance they had maintained. What happens now? He asked. Elena looked up from the book, considering the question seriously. I don't know. I've never done anything like this before. Neither have I, David admitted. But I know I don't want to go back to pretending we're just neighbors who talk about the weather. Elena smiled, closing the book and reaching for his hand. Then we don't pretend. We figure it out as we go. Outside, the neighborhood settled into another quiet Sunday evening. But inside the old house on Maple Street, two people who had been strangers that morning were falling asleep together, finally understanding what it meant to be truly seen by another person. Monday morning arrived like a gentle slap of reality. David woke up alone in his bed, and for a moment he wondered if the entire weekend had been an elaborate dream. Then he smelled coffee brewing downstairs and heard Elena humming along to her classical music, and he knew everything had changed. The next few weeks felt like learning to walk on a tightrope. One day they would spend the evening together, talking and laughing like they had known each other for years. The next day they would pass each other on the stairs and suddenly feel awkward, unsure whether to act like neighbors or something more. Elena started leaving little notes with his mail. Nothing romantic or overwhelming, just small observations about her day. The roses in Mrs. Chen's garden are blooming. Or, saw 3 cardinals at the bird feeder this morning. David found himself looking forward to these tiny messages more than he cared to admit. David began working earlier in the mornings, so he could take breaks when Elena was in her garden. He would make an excuse to check the mailbox or water the plants by the front steps, just to have a reason to talk to her. Their conversations were still careful, but underneath the talk about weather and neighborhood news, something deeper was growing. The hardest part was the uncertainty. David had been married for 6 years before his divorce. He knew how to be someone's husband, how to navigate the daily routine of a committed relationship. But this thing with Elena was different. It was more fragile, more precious, and much more terrifying. Some nights David would lie in bed listening to Elena moving around downstairs and wonder if he was reading too much into everything. Maybe that Sunday had been a moment of loneliness for both of them. Nothing more. Maybe Elena was already regretting the vulnerability she had shared with him. Elena was dealing with her own doubts. She had lived alone for 3 years and she had gotten good at it. She liked her independence, her quiet routines, her freedom to paint at 3 in the morning without worrying about disturbing anyone. But now she found herself thinking about David constantly, wondering what he was working on, whether he had eaten lunch, if he was happy. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening in October. David was struggling with a particularly difficult logo design for a law firm that couldn't decide what they wanted. He had been staring at his computer screen for hours, moving elements around without making any real progress. Elena knocked on his door around 8 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the paint-stained apron she used when she was working on a new piece. "You've been sighing very loudly for the past hour," she said with a smile. "I thought you might need a break." David laughed, realizing he had indeed been sighing without knowing it. "Is my frustration really that obvious?" "The whole house knows when you're having trouble with a project," Elena said, settling into the chair across from his desk. You get very quiet, then you start muttering, then you sigh like the world is ending. I had no idea I was so transparent. It's actually kind of endearing, Elena said, like living with a creative genius who hasn't figured out he's a creative genius yet. David felt something warm spread through his chest. It wasn't just the compliment, though that meant more to him than Elena probably realized. It was the way she said it, like she had been watching him work and thinking about him with genuine fondness. Can I show you what I'm stuck on? David asked, turning his laptop toward her. Elena studied the screen for a few minutes, her head tilted slightly to one side in concentration. David found himself watching her face instead of the design, noticing the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking hard, the way she bit her lower lip when she was considering something carefully. What if you made the text smaller and added more space around it? Elena suggested. Sometimes less is more elegant. David made the changes and immediately the design looked better, cleaner, more professional. That's perfect, he said, genuinely amazed. How did you see what I couldn't? Fresh eyes, Elena said. And maybe because I'm not as emotionally invested in it as you are. They spent the next 2 hours working together. Elena would look at his designs and offer suggestions, while David helped her think through the layout for a series of paintings she was planning. It felt natural, comfortable, like they were meant to collaborate this way. We make a good team, David said as they were cleaning up. Elena nodded, but then her expression grew more serious. David, what are we doing? I mean, really doing? It was the question they had both been avoiding for weeks. David set down his coffee mug and looked at her directly. I don't know, he said honestly. I've never had a situation like this before. Living in the same house, trying to figure out if we're friends or neighbors or something more. It's complicated, Elena agreed. But I like it, David said quickly. I like whatever this is we're building. I like that you bring me tea when I'm frustrated. I like that you trust me enough to show me your paintings. I like that I can make you laugh. Elena smiled, the tension in her shoulders relaxing. I like it too. I like that you listen when I talk about art, that you remember little things I mention. I like that you shovel the snow without being asked and that you hum when you're happy. So maybe we don't need to define it right now, David suggested. Maybe we can just let it be what it is and see where it goes. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. I'd like that. But I want you to know that this isn't casual for me. Whatever we're building, it matters. It matters to me too, David said, squeezing her hand gently. That night, for the first time since that rainy Sunday, Elena fell asleep on David's couch while they were watching an old movie together. David covered her with a blanket and went to sleep in his own bed, but something had shifted between them. The awkwardness was fading, replaced by a quiet confidence that they were building something real and lasting. The next morning, Elena left him a note that simply said, "Thank you for letting me figure this out with you." David kept that note in his wallet, a reminder that some of the best things in life couldn't be rushed or defined, only experienced one day at a time. 6 months later, the old house on Maple Street felt completely different, even though nothing obvious had changed. The same squeaky stairs, the same morning light through the kitchen windows, the same neighbors walking their dogs past the front yard. But inside, David and Elena had created something neither of them had expected when they first became landlady and tenant. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was built through hundreds of small moments. Elena bringing David soup when he worked too late to eat properly. David helping Elena hang her paintings for better lighting. Quiet evenings spent reading in the same room, comfortable with shared silence. Morning conversations over coffee that stretched into afternoon discussions about everything and nothing. David had moved his main computer setup to the small room in the basement, converting it into a proper office. This gave Elena more space for her art studio in what used to be the formal dining room, and it meant they could work in parallel without disturbing each other. But more importantly, it felt like they were building a life together instead of just sharing a house. The professional collaboration had grown naturally. Elena's eye for composition and color made David's design work stronger, while his understanding of marketing and visual communication helped Elena think about her art in new ways. She had started creating pieces specifically meant to be reproduced as prints, and David designed the layouts and promotional materials. Their first real success came when the downtown coffee shop that had commissioned David's logo asked if he knew any local artists who could provide artwork for their walls. David immediately thought of Elena, and within a week she had 3 paintings hanging in the shop with small cards listing her contact information. "I sold 2 pieces just from people seeing them at the coffee shop," Elena told David excitedly on a Thursday evening in March. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Elena with paint still under her fingernails, David with his laptop open to show her the website he was building for a local bookstore. "That's amazing," David said, and he meant it completely. Watching Elena succeed felt almost as good as his own achievements. "I told you people would connect with your work." "The woman who bought the landscape piece said it reminded her of morning walks with her grandmother," Elena said, her eyes bright with happiness. "She said she could feel the peace in it." David reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's exactly what art should do." Elena had been equally supportive of David's goals. When he mentioned his dream of designing book covers, she didn't just encourage him. She used her connections in the local arts community to introduce him to people who might help. Through a friend of Elena's who taught at the community college, David met a professor who was self-publishing a collection of short stories. The first book cover David designed was for a small poetry collection that sold maybe 50 copies. But seeing his work on an actual book, holding it in his hands, felt like proof that dreams could become reality if you had someone who believed in them as much as you did. "Look at this," David said, showing Elena the email he had just received. "The university press wants me to design covers for their spring catalog. 6 books. Elena looked up from the canvas she was working on, a piece filled with warm yellows and gentle blues that somehow captured the feeling of contentment. "David, that's wonderful. How did they hear about you?" "The professor I worked with recommended me," David said, still hardly believing it. "She said I understood how to make books look approachable and intriguing at the same time." "Because you love stories," Elena said simply. "It shows in your work." These moments of shared success felt different from anything David had experienced in his marriage. With his ex-wife, achievements had sometimes become competitions, comparisons, reasons for resentment. With Elena, success felt like something they were building together, each victory making the other stronger. They had established rhythms that worked for both of them. Mornings were for individual work, David at his computer, Elena at her easel. Afternoons often involved collaboration or errands together. Evenings were for cooking, talking, and the quiet intimacy of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The neighbors had noticed the change too, though they were too polite to comment directly. Mrs. Chen from next door had started bringing them vegetables from her garden, clearly treating them as a couple. The family across the street waved to both of them now when they were working in the yard together. The mail carrier left packages with either David or Elena, knowing they would make sure the other person got them. One Saturday in late spring, they decided to host their first dinner party. Elena invited 2 friends from her art circle, and David asked his old college roommate and his wife, who lived about an hour away. The evening was David's idea, but Elena was equally excited about it. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked as they prepared dinner together, moving around the kitchen in the easy coordination they had developed over months of cooking together. "A little," David admitted, stirring the sauce for the pasta. "I haven't entertained since before my divorce. I'm out of practice." "We're entertaining," Elena corrected gently. "Together. That makes it easier." She was right. Having Elena there, sharing the hosting responsibilities, made David feel confident in a way he hadn't expected. When his friend Tom arrived with his wife, the first thing Tom said was how happy David looked. "I haven't seen you smile this much in years," Tom said quietly while Elena was showing his wife her latest paintings. David watched Elena explaining her technique, her hands moving gracefully as she described how she layered colors to create depth. She was wearing the blue dress he had complimented months ago, and her hair caught the light from the lamps they had arranged throughout the living room. "I feel like myself again," David told Tom. "Maybe more myself than I've ever been." The evening was a success in all the ways that mattered. The food was good, the conversation flowed easily, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. Elena's art friends were impressed by David's design portfolio, and Tom's wife immediately commissioned Elena to paint something for their anniversary. As they cleaned up together after their guests left, David found himself thinking about how natural this felt. Not the entertaining, though that had gone well, but the whole life they had built together. The easy partnership, the way they supported each other's dreams, the comfortable intimacy of knowing someone completely. That was fun, Elena said, loading the last of the dishes into the dishwasher. We should do it again sometime. Definitely, David agreed, then paused. Elena, can I ask you something? She looked up from wiping down the counter, and David was struck again by how beautiful she was. Not just physically, but in all the ways that mattered. Beautiful in her kindness, her creativity, her courage in taking emotional risks. What is it? She asked. David took a breath, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since that first night when she had appeared in his doorway. Are you happy? With this, with us, with how everything turned out? Elena set down the dish towel and moved closer to him, her expression soft and certain. David, I'm happier than I ever thought I could be. This thing we built together, it's everything I didn't know I was looking for. She reached up and touched his face, the same gentle gesture she had made that first night, but now it spoke of belonging instead of hope. When I walked up those stairs 6 months ago, I was just hoping you might feel something for me too, Elena continued. I never imagined we would build an actual life together. David pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right this all felt. I love you, he said, the words coming easily because they were simply true. I love you too, Elena replied, and her smile was the same one she had given him in his doorway all those months ago, but deeper now, richer with shared experience and genuine partnership. Outside, the neighborhood settled into another quiet Saturday night. But inside the old house on Maple Street, two people who had started as careful strangers had become something rare and precious, partners in every sense of the word, building a love that was as creative and collaborative as the work they did together.